Today we are going to give some love to arguably the most forgotten continent in alternate history, by exploring one of their most famous what-ifs, Gran Colombia, and the exploits of its liberator, Simón Bolivar. Coming from humble origins, he would take advantage of Napoleon's invasion of Spain, and the weakening of the Spanish Empire, to slowly but steadily lead an independence war from his homeland of Venezuela into Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and as deep as Bolivia. He got the title of El Libertador, the Liberator, and his legacy is upheld in no minor way through having a nation named after him. Following his victories against the Spanish, Gran Colombia was his primary project, a nation unifying what are now Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. But just by that explanation, you will realize a problem. Gran Colombia did not last. Within a decade of founding, it had already collapsed. The reasons for this are numerous, which we will explore soon. But to a large degree, it was due to political disagreement, partially on the question of federalization or centralization, and partially over the power of the presidency. As these political battles escalated, ego, corruption, and power politics tore the nation apart, and a sickly Bolivar did not manage to mend it back together. Venezuela would be the first to secede, and soon after, the entire project was over. Today, we will discuss the story of the rise and fall of Gran Colombia, and how we might help Bolivar lead it into a better direction. Now first, how did Latin America win their independence? Arguably, it can mostly be attributed to one single man, Napoleon Bonaparte. While the Spanish Empire had significant issues, there was not yet a spark for outright independence war. The Spanish armies were still powerful enough to snuff out any uprising that did occur. It was Napoleon which changed that through his invasion of Spain, in which he deposed the Spanish monarchs and installed his brother as a puppet king. Far from an easy takeover, the Spanish continued fighting until the very defeat of Napoleon. At this point, you may think, Spain is in shambles, what a perfect opportunity to achieve independence in a swift and orderly fashion. But that is not quite what happened. Despite a war raging in Europe, Bonapartist Spain has pretty much no recognition in the Americas, and France didn't have the navy nor the resources to change that by force. The colonies near unanimously remained loyal to the deposed King Ferdinand VII. Only problem, he was held in French custody. There was no clear Spanish government, the capital was controlled by the French. How could you govern in those conditions? Well, the answer was juntas, temporary governments set up to fight the war against the French, both within Spain and in the Americas. But without a clear hierarchy, these juntas swiftly started infighting. For example, some juntas claimed dominance over others. Sevilla attempted to claim, as the most important peninsular port, to represent the entire overseas empire. A central junta would be formed to govern and lead the war, bringing together representatives from all over the empire, but the Spanish juntas got significantly more representation than the colonial regions, despite the colonies having more people than Spain by this point. But there was also infighting within the colonies, as juntas began to claim sovereignty over each other's, and cities began to compete for capital and power, and sub-juntas claiming their own autonomy over larger ones. Things got worse when the French pushed south, capturing Sevilla, where the central junta initially met, while also putting its new meeting place, Cadiz, under siege. With most of Spain in French hands, the American colonies grew increasingly restless. They were severely underrepresented in governance, but it would now be their money primarily paying for this war of resistance. An attempt was made at a new central junta, with more equal representation, and a liberal constitution was even written. But still, the colonies began to take more and more autonomy for themselves. Political debates began to emerge between liberals and royalists within these American colonies. Mostly, Both sides started recognizing the rule of Ferdinand VII, but the liberals hoped to maintain autonomy and empire-wide reforms, while royalists wanted a return to Spanish absolutism. The region got increasingly chaotic, giving way to an even more radical group, independence fighters, seeking to remove Spanish rule altogether. Madrid had been ruling the continent for 3 centuries now, and the people of the region developed their own cultures, their own elites, and their own priorities. The decline of the central junta increasingly radicalized the liberals towards independence, especially when Ferdinand did return to power in 1813 and swiftly disavowed the constitution in favor of absolutism. Increasingly, independence was seen as the only way forward. Rio de la Grande would be the first region to break with the empire, but beyond that, most independence movements struggled to actually gather steam and maintain their independence, as Spain played cat and mouse with the revolutionaries. Interestingly, most of the revolutions only found success after Napoleon was already defeated, despite, on paper, Spain now being in a better position to reassert their control, as they launched terror campaigns against the revolutionaries. This is finally where Bolivar comes into play. Through military success, he managed to become dictator of Venezuela in 1814, but soon after he faced setbacks, resigning his command and going on a self-imposed exile to Jamaica. Here, he penned his most important literary work, the Jamaica Letter. In it, he summarized his grand vision for the future of the Spanish Americas, instrumental when discussing what Bolivar may have hoped to accomplish. The letter was partially meant to appeal to a Latin American audience, fanning the flames of revolution, but also to appeal to Britain, whose support could prove decisive in breaking apart the Spanish Empire. Bolivar's vision for Gran Colombia was a continuation of the borders of the former Viceroyalty of New Granada. Its government would be based on the British model, having an upper house with hereditary positions and a lower house directly elected. Most importantly, he sought a strong executive, with a president that could be elected for life. This was one of the main political weaknesses of Bolivar, as his opponents criticized this as a ploy for personal power. His commitment to a centralized Gran Colombia would be one of the pieces in his later downfall. But Bolivar dreamt of far more than just Gran Colombia. He foresaw a string of republics, from Rio de la Plata in the south to Mexico in the north, which could then form a loose confederation all across Latin America. Not necessarily full unification, but perhaps something akin to the modern European Union. Representatives would meet in a central location, like Panama, discussing matters which affected the whole continent, working to encourage trade and commerce, discourage wars by arbitration, and forming a defensive alliance against foreign threats. A massive goal symbolizing the immense ambitions held by this man. Bolivar's exile would prove short, as he soon once again returned to Venezuela and liberated it. After setting up a government and securing his rule, he once again led a liberation into Colombia, this time with massive success. He merged the two regions to officially form the Greater Republic of Colombia, Gran Colombia. Following an independence declaration from Panama, they likewise joined the state, and through the conquest of Ecuador, the nation reached its full form. Meanwhile, from the south, another liberator was coming up, José de San Martín. He, from Rio de la Plata, had helped liberate Chile, Paraguay, and Peru, dealing a massive blow to Spanish power on the continent. Bolivar and San Martín would meet each other to discuss the future of the independence wars, but unfortunately, the meeting went poorly. While the exact events are up for interpretation, it seems that San Martín would argue for constitutional monarchies in the liberated territories, while Bolivar favored full republics. By the end of the meeting, San Martín went to Lima, announced Peru's independence, and then went on to Congress to relinquish his power. He voluntarily retired, first to Argentina and later to France, leaving the further liberation of the continent to Bolivar himself. This was important, as the situation in Peru soon swung back into the favor of the royalists, and the Peruvian Congress now directly appealed to Bolivar for help. He accepted and led his army south, being named dictator of Peru. It was here that, arguably, Bolivar's immense ambition began to overwhelm the man. The expectations of a continent were being placed on his shoulders. After Peru, he would go even further, with the region of Upper Peru naming itself after him as he led its liberation. They offered him the presidency as well, but he instead gave it to Sucre, a trusted confidant. Yet, he did write the constitution for the new state, which he would later apply to Peru as well. The Spanish, by this point, were practically gone from the continent, but still, it seemed like his real problems were only just starting. Bolivar had been removed from power in Colombia due to his new position in Peru, a decision by its Congress which Bolivar did agree with. Yet, his vice president, now acting president, was very unpopular, and significant tensions were growing with José Antonio Páez, who was increasingly seen as a fighter for Venezuelan autonomy. The battle between federalism and centralism was heating up again, and elites seeking more power and influence were scheming in the background. The Peruvian Congress, likewise, sought to depose their new liberator. Bolivar did actually manage to get a Congress called to discuss his Pan-Americanism, but in the end, only Gran Colombia would sign the treaty that came from it. Rio de la Plata requested aid against Brazil, but Bolivar had none to offer. Everything that Bolivar had spent the last decade to build up would fall apart in half that time. Upon his return to Colombia, Bolivar returned to power, installing his constitution there too. But he struggled to get Santander and Páez under control. Frustrated, he submitted his resignation, but Congress rejected it. Colombian forces in Peru then mutinied, giving the Peruvians an excuse to depose Bolivar and repeal his constitution. In debates between federalism or centralism, the Federalists had the upper hand. Bolivar himself kept out of these debates, greatly weakening his side, while his allies decided to walk out of the Congress, and chaos ensued. Bolivar would be installed as President Liberator, with absolute authority, only to soon after face a near assassination and coup attempt. Bolivar had often been a sickly man, but it was now growing worse. He considered resigning from politics again, but had to respond to a Peruvian invasion of Ecuador and Bolivia, once more leaving Gran Colombia behind to figure their politics out for themselves. Immediately, the people he left in charge began a plot to install a Bourbon monarch once Bolivar passed away. Learning of this, Bolivar simply demanded they stopped this coup, but instead, they resigned. Soon after, Venezuela seceded in the political chaos, and Bolivar was exhausted. He hoped to live out the rest of his life in a self-imposed exile in England, but he never even made it. Later in the year, he would pass away from tuberculosis, and soon after, Ecuador seceded too. His dreams of Gran Colombia, of a unified Latin America, they died with him. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. So with all that covered, how can we let Bolivar succeed? Well, it depends a lot on our definition of success. Fact is, there were some fundamental issues with Bolivar's ambition which hindered his ultimate success. One of these is the region itself. Sure, many were united by a common Spanish language, but were divided by geography and culture. There was not a full shared identity running from Uruguay to Mexico. There is a common idea that by this stage, Latin America was, well, Latin. Yet the indigenous population still made up massive amounts of the population in many regions. On screen are just some broad estimates, as we do lack the concrete figures of the time. But especially in the middle, massive populations, potentially even majorities of natives, did persist. Geography also encouraged regionalism, with major mountain ranges and rainforests making overland cooperation more difficult and dividing the major population centers. However much we try, these are factors which we can't really solve. But in the political arena, there are, in my opinion, two ways which may give him more success, which we will explore in two separate timelines. The first is having him focus more on his homeland, preventing getting overstretched by trying to rule Peru and Bolivia as well, ensuring that, if nothing else, Gran Colombia itself persists as a powerful force in the north. Now that does not mean allowing the Spanish to remain to his south. Colombia absolutely benefits from removing Spain from the continent entirely, if only to ensure they cannot later try to reclaim Colombia. But in helping liberate those territories, don't get personally involved. Let others figure out the politics and future of those nations. The second option is more ambitious and requires a more fundamental change in Bolivar's politics. In my mind, it is a bit odd how he argued for a confederation of Latin American states, but went so hard on Gran Colombian centralization. I don't think it would be that crazy to have him be more open to federalization, dropping his plans for being a president for life, perhaps being more inspired by the United States rather than Britain. This could very possibly ease his political troubles of separatism, and in some very extreme cases, may manage to create an absolute beast of a South American state. So first, what if Bolivar decided to limit his focus? After his victories in Gran Colombia, he halts and spends more time consolidating his new realm. Colombian forces do participate in the continuing liberations of Peru and Bolivia, but he does not concern himself with writing constitutions and leading those nations. In fact, in such a timeline, Bolivar may do well to strike a joint platform with San Martin, supporting the latter's efforts in liberation and letting the nations themselves decide on their own government, monarchy or not. Thus, as Peru and Bolivia, now not named Bolivia, are liberated, we have two benefits for Bolivar. He can focus on Gran Colombia, but also his relations with the rest of the continent are greatly improved, as there is far less anxiety about Bolivar's growing power on the continent. Since Bolivar never ruled Peru, he would have far more leeway to prevent plots and power grabs from the likes of Santander and Paez, and Gran Colombian politics can, hopefully, be shaped for the better because of it. Still, a lot depends on how he does this, specifically, how solid the balance of power within the new Colombian state is going to be. As you may know, Latin American politics has never been the most stable, arguably being the most politically unstable region during this era. Fixing this will be very hard, and in my opinion, Bolivar's constitutions in our timeline were not very good for stability. The constitutions he implemented in Bolivia and Peru essentially turned the president into a monarch. Sure, power was not handed over hereditarily, but the president would still rule for life and have the power to appoint his successor. The president could name senators, sign laws, control the military, etc., while the legislature was rather weak and the judiciary was likewise not independent. If any constitution like this passes, I have absolutely no faith in the political future of Gran Colombia. In that light, I far prefer the Colombian Constitution of 1821, wherein the president would only serve for 4 years and could only stand for re-election once. Bolivar also showed that he was willing to listen to Congress during his time in power. So, with the benefit of the doubt, he may create a stable, multi-power structure within Gran Colombia. We could then start to wonder about his next most ambitious project, the unification of the former Spanish Americas. His main attempt at this historically was the Congress of Panama. To this conference, every single American state was invited. including the US and Brazil, while the Dutch and the British were invited as observers. Although that is not totally true, Paraguay was the only nation not invited, as it was relatively isolationist and had refused contact with Bolivar. The goal of this meeting was grand, as it discussed what is known as the Treaty of Union, League, and Perpetual Confederation. Loosely, the Congress imagined something akin to Europe's Concert of Europe, seeking interstate cooperation to ensure peace in the region and ensure issues are solved by diplomacy rather than descending into armed conflict. Some of the most important points were collective defense against Spanish and other European attempts at recolonization, and in general, formulating a consistent, united policy regarding Europe. Wars between member states should be avoided and settled by arbitration. Regime change would cause a nation to be automatically suspended until restored by unanimous vote. A permanent assembly should also be created to regularly discuss and sort out common issues, while furthering economic cooperation wherever possible. Now, this plan was already significantly watered down from what Bolivar had actually hoped for, as his plan called for an even tighter version of federalism, with a joint, permanent standing army, federal oversight over the states, etc. But this was considered way too extreme for many of the participants, and the treaty as written was already one of the most ambitious proposals for interstate cooperation in history. But, as you might expect, the treaty never actually went into effect. Out of the invited states, Chile and Rio de la Plata declined to join, as they disdained Bolivar and feared his personal influence. Brazil initially accepted, but changed their mind at the last moment, fearful of the anti-slavery, majority Hispanic nations, and because their war with Argentina could make it awkward. Bolivia did accept, but they simply came too late. Same with the US delegates, which had been sabotaged by the southern slavers. Out of the 4 states which actually participated, only Gran Colombia itself, in the end, signed the treaty, and the idea died there. But there is at least reason for cautious optimism that Bolivia could be more successful in this timeline. Exactly because he has chosen to remain hands-off regarding Peru and Bolivia, there would be less fears of his domination over such a confederation. His alliance with Rio de la Plata's San Martin may likewise improve their image of Bolivar. Perhaps he could go even further by sending support to Rio de la Plata in their war against Brazil, both even further improving relations with the state, as well as reaffirming his commitment to the joint future of the Hispanic nations. Another point is that Bolivar himself was on campaign in Peru while this Congress took place. Him actually being there could just contribute in making it a success, assuming he is capable of compromising on his initial vision. Now, if he is even remotely successful, this alternate timeline truly grows wings, with, in a maximalist sense, a confederation now stretching from Argentina to Mexico. Of course, this would be extremely ambitious, and there were plenty of opportunities for it to later fall. Even in just a decade after it being signed, it would need to deal with events like the breakup of the Central American Republic, the Cisplatin War between Argentina and Brazil, consistent political issues and regime change in Mexico, including a Texan War of Independence. Beyond that, that would be assuming every state that signs the treaty would adhere to it. So no funny business, like Peru invading Bolivia or Colombia, and of course, Gran Colombia itself would also need to remain intact. The amount of strain put on this treaty, even if it is ratified, is immense. It is therefore very plausible, if not likely, that if it is signed, it swiftly dies under this strain. Nations may refuse to support the war against Brazil, and Rio de la Plata abandons the treaty before it is properly implemented. The collapse of the Central American republics divides the Union over how to respond, and leaves Mexico even more isolated than they already were, causing them to de facto abandon it as well. What remains of the Union falls apart, quite possibly out of renewed fears of Grand Colombian domination without other nations to balance it out. In that case, the conclusion to this scenario leaves us with a large Gran Colombia, second only to Brazil in terms of population. From there, the scenario will mostly depend on the internal developments of the new state. Does it remain politically stable? Does it industrialize? How does it perform economically? Those questions are the most important, because as you will know, South America just isn't that flexible in terms of alternate history. To a big extent, because their geography just isn't conducive to large-scale conflict. And for the most part, whether or not Gran Colombia sustains itself as a powerful state will not radically influence the way in which the world at large develops, and the changes will mostly be subtle, focused on the stability and prosperity of the region itself. So for now, I will leave this scenario here. But if the Confederation was to be successful, it might help to reduce its scope. Most importantly, by cutting off Mexico and Central America, as with the distance between population centers and their political instability, such a grand union just isn't practical. And the north and the south of the Confederation would have entirely different political priorities. It may be better to have a more tight-knit confederation, focusing specifically on South America, rallying primarily because of the war against Brazil, creating a stronger pan-Hispanic line against the Brazilians. This could well allow the Argentinians to achieve a victory in Uruguay, or perhaps even begin supporting Brazilian separatists. But even more compromised victories could see Uruguay become independent, but it then likewise joining the Confederation. The results for the continent could be immense. Brazil historically positioned itself as the South American superpower, yet their success was mainly based on the fact that the Hispanic nations were, individually, much weaker than Brazil, and they often fought themselves as well. But a comprehensive alliance of the Hispanic states easily outpopulates Brazil. Brazil therefore cannot go on the offensive, as they would risk facing a front line the size of a continent. There were also conflicts between Hispanic states, which caused tensions to this very day. Such conflicts being solved through cooperation and closer economic ties would overall cause Latin America to become a more integrated, safe and wealthy region. And all we could hope is that internal disagreements don't tear it all apart later. Now, in a complete fantasy world, we could take this even further. The Texan War of Independence was close fought, and with some Hispanic support, Mexico could potentially win. Beyond that, the US Army was never that impressive. Could it be possible that the Hispanic world together could prevent America's seizure of Mexican territories? Or at least, threaten to make the war so costly it is not economically beneficial for the US to start it? The idea of a union from Mexico to Argentina, with so many different nationalities, interests and priorities actually remaining united, is of course, sadly, near impossible. But it is a beautiful example of optimistic, revolutionary idealism. Finally then, a totally different course is dropping the broader pan-Hispanic unification movement, but focusing on the creation of a smaller but even tighter union. Here, we could suggest we don't change Bolivar's actions in South America as we did last time. He still becomes the leader of Peru and continues on to liberate Bolivia, placing a significant portion of the continent under his personal influence. But this time, perhaps he is more federalist-minded. He solves political disputes in Gran Colombia through devolving power, while keeping himself as the unifying figure trying to tie the nation together. Then, perhaps a way to further expand this is to still have Peru depose Bolivar and seek a conflict with Bolivia and Gran Colombia. But what if, after the Peruvian armies are defeated, Bolivar goes for a perhaps radical solution, adding Peru to the Gran Colombian Federation. In due time, perhaps Bolivia could be added as well. Now once more, even just this proposal is extremely ambitious. While the success of such a federation would be immensely influential on the prosperity of the region, there is also a lot of fuel to the forces of disillusion. Could Bolivar handle the troubles of the time, or would this be another example of overreach? As I would put my money that this may lead to an even more violent dissolution of the state. If, however, such a union is successful, it would be a Latin American hegemon to rival the Brazilians. Their united power could prevent the massive losses the individual states faced across their history. They have the bargaining power to be a mid-sized power in American politics. They control Panama, potentially allowing them to participate in the creation of a canal, or potentially leading to an alternate Nicaragua canal being realized instead. Now, once again, the long-term consequences of this scenario will focus on the people of the state itself, with hopes for a stronger economic growth to cooperation and the joint bargaining power of the state against the wannabe South American hegemon of Brazil and the later influence of the US. Yet, once again, its broader conclusions will, beyond unpredictable butterflies, be rather localized. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, I'm sure the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching and goodbye.